It was not a dramatic lie, no great thunderclap of deceit, no poisoned chalice raised aloft in the candlelight. It was, rather, the quiet, respectable sort of lie that passes between people of standing without remark. "What a very pleasant evening this has been," said Lady Eveline Ashworth to her host, Sir Percival Grantham, as she collected her wrap from the footman and prepared to take her leave of Grantham House at number 11, Whitmore Square, Belgravia. Sir Percival, who had spent the better part of the evening watching his guests with the hunted expression of a man seated atop a powder keg and aware, at some cellular level, of the approaching match, had smiled. "You are too kind," he said. And that, too, was a lie. It was 11 o'clock. There were 6 guests remaining. The dinner party had shed 2 of its original 8 members earlier, a young couple called Harcourt who had pleaded the nursemaid's half-day, and they departed one by one into the foggy November dark, with the polished efficiency of people who have much to think about and prefer to think it in private. By 1:15, the house was quiet. By 1:30, it was quieter still. At 20 minutes to midnight, Miss Dorothea Vane, companion to Lady Ashworth, and a woman possessed of the fine-boned watchfulness that companions, by professional necessity, develop, looked up from the upper landing of the house across the square. Number 14, Whitmore Square, was directly opposite. It was, she would later tell the police, perfectly illuminated. The fog had not yet thickened to its most obstructive, and the tall sash windows of the first-floor drawing-room were uncurtained and ablaze with gaslight. What she saw, or believed she saw, in the space of perhaps 4 seconds, was this: a figure standing very still at the window. And then, with a movement that struck her afterwards as peculiarly boneless, a terrible sideways collapse. Dorothea Vane was not a woman who screamed. She was, however, a woman who acted. She seized Lady Ashworth's arm, directed a pointed and imperative stare at number 14 across the square, and said, with the precision of someone dictating a telegram, "Eveline, someone has fallen." The man who had fallen was Mr. Roland Ashby. He was, or had been, until approximately 11:38 on the evening of the 14th, the occupant of number 14, Whitmore Square, a gentleman of 43 years, considerable private income, and a reputation in certain drawing-rooms as a man who knew rather more than was comfortable about rather too many people. He had been, in the language of those who disliked him, well informed. In the language of those who feared him, and there were several, it would emerge, he had been something considerably less flattering. He was found by his valet, Cresswell, at 11:42, having slipped past the locked study door through the simple expedient of possessing a spare key. Mr. Ashby lay upon the Persian rug before the window, the same window through which Miss Vane had observed his collapse, with a look of faint surprise upon his face that Cresswell would describe, with unimpeachable butler's neutrality, as "most unlike the master's usual expression, sir." There was no wound visible, no blood, no sign of struggle. The room was, in its outward appointments, perfectly orderly. The fire had burned low but not out. 2 brandy glasses stood upon the side table, one used and one clean, and a leather-bound ledger lay open upon the writing desk at a page of dense, cramped entries that no one would examine for some hours yet. The window, the great uncurtained sash window through which gaslight had poured and through which Dorothea Vane had watched a man die, was latched from the inside. The position of the body, the locked door, the window fastened from within, these, my friend, are not mysteries. They are the props of a conjurer. And Poirot, he does not go to the theatre to watch the tricks. He goes to understand the magician. H. Poirot. Inspector Gideon Marsh of Scotland Yard arrived at number 14 at 12:17. He was a solid, methodical man with a grey moustache and a settled conviction that murders, like bus routes, followed predictable paths if one only waited long enough. He examined the body, spoke briefly with Cresswell, took a statement from the uniformed constable who had arrived first, and formed a preliminary opinion by 12:45, which was that Roland Ashby had suffered a heart attack. The medical examiner would confirm it. Brought on, perhaps, by the brandy. Perhaps by the fire, perhaps by the general exertions of the evening. It was a tidy conclusion. Inspector Marsh appreciated tidiness. It was, as he remarked to his sergeant, an open and shut matter, barring the formalities. He was still of this opinion on the morning of the 15th, when the medical examiner submitted his preliminary report. He was considerably less certain of it by the afternoon of the 15th, when the examiner telephoned to revise his findings, and by the morning of the 16th, when the word aconitine entered the conversation with the quiet devastation of a stone dropped into still water, Inspector Marsh had ceased to be certain of anything whatsoever. Aconitine, the alkaloid extracted from the plant Aconitum napellus, known in the hedgerows of England as wolfsbane or monkshood, or, with the directness of older times, as the devil's helmet. It was, the toxicologist informed the increasingly unhappy Inspector Marsh, one of the most potent natural poisons known to science. It produced, in sufficient dosage, a paralysis of the heart that was indistinguishable, in the early stages, from cardiac failure. It was colorless. It was very nearly tasteless. And it left, in a body not specifically tested for it, virtually no trace that a busy examiner conducting a routine post-mortem would think to seek. Roland Ashby had not died of a heart attack. Roland Ashby had been murdered. And he had been murdered, the evidence strongly suggested, by means of something he had drunk, or been given to drink, in the sealed, locked first-floor drawing-room of his own house within shouting distance of Whitmore Square, while his dinner guests were still dispersing into the November fog, and while a woman in the window opposite watched him fall. The case was, as Inspector Marsh informed his superintendent with an expression of considerable personal affront, a devilish business from start to finish. It was his superintendent, a man of broader imagination and a longer memory for cases that had, in the past, benefited from a certain unconventional approach, who made the telephone call. And it was in this manner that, on the cold, bright morning of the 17th of November, a small, precise figure in an overcoat of remarkable cut descended from a taxicab before number 14, Whitmore Square, surveyed the house with the focused attention of a man appraising an opponent across a chessboard, and straightened, with one gloved finger, a moustache of quite extraordinary symmetry. Hercule Poirot had arrived. There were, Inspector Marsh reflected, 6 people who had dined at Grantham House on the evening Roland Ashby died. 6 people who had sat within arm's reach of him, shared his host's Bordeaux, and departed into the fog, each carrying, it would emerge, something they would greatly have preferred not to. Sir Percival Grantham was the host, silver-haired, impeccably correct, and possessed of the watchful stillness of a man who has learned, through costly experience, to keep his alarm entirely off his face. He had known Ashby for 20 years. Whether this constituted friendship or the prolonged endurance of mutual inconvenience, no one could quite say. His wife had died 3 years prior. He lived alone at number 11 with 2 servants, and, it was rumoured, a quantity of debt that his tailoring did considerable work to conceal. Lady Eveline Ashworth, no relation to the deceased, though the proximity of names had caused confusion throughout the evening, was a widow of 60, handsome, wealthy, and sharp as the edge of a paper knife. She had arrived with her companion, Miss Vane. She had spoken to Ashby exactly twice during dinner, both times with the careful neutrality of someone exercising considerable restraint. She did not explain why she had been invited, and Sir Percival did not explain why he had invited her. Miss Dorothea Vane herself, the witness, thin, observant, and possessed of the particular invisibility of women in her position, she had watched everything and been noticed by almost no one, which was, in its way, its own species of evidence. Captain James Fellows, retired, sat at the far end of the table with the aggressive joviality of a man performing good spirits under some strain. He was 45, broad-shouldered, and had served in Ashby's regiment. He laughed loudly and ate little. He twice refilled Ashby's glass. When asked later whether he and Ashby had been close, he said, "In the way that men who've been in the field together are close." He did not elaborate. Mrs. Cecily Forrest was 32, beautiful in the fragile, slightly febrile manner of someone who sleeps badly, and had been seated, deliberately or otherwise, directly beside Ashby. She was the wife of a diplomat currently posted to Vienna. She spoke French to Ashby at one point, quietly, and did not repeat it in English when Lady Ashworth glanced over. And, lastly, Mr. Oliver Tench, solicitor, dry and colourless as a legal brief, who had arrived late, eaten methodically, and spent the greater part of the evening watching the others with the professional interest of a man who manages, among other things, other people's secrets. 6 guests, 1 dead man, and somewhere among them, or so Poirot would come with absolute certainty to believe, a murderer who had dined on braised pheasant and felt, as they stepped into the fog, the very particular relief of a plan completed. Inspector Marsh had been forewarned. He had, in fact, been warned twice. Once by his superintendent, and once by a colleague at the Yard who had worked a case in Devonshire some years prior and offered the advice with the earnest particularity of a man describing unusual weather. "He sees things," the colleague had said. "Things you'd rather he didn't." Marsh had thanked him and formed no very definite expectation. The reality of Hercule Poirot was simultaneously less and more alarming than anticipated. He was small, distinctly, almost aggressively small, with a head of remarkable egg-like perfection and a moustache that Inspector Marsh, who wore a moustache himself, regarded with baffled professional respect. He was dressed with a care so extreme it crossed some invisible threshold and became, on the other side, a kind of statement. His overcoat was of a quality that had no business appearing in a Belgravia murder inquiry on a grey November morning. He stood on the pavement before number 14 and did not, as Marsh had expected, immediately request admission. He stood, and he looked. He examined the facade of the house with his head slightly tilted, as a painter might examine a canvas he has not yet decided whether to admire. He looked at the windows, the tall first-floor sash in particular, and then, with a deliberate slowness, he turned and looked across the square at number 11, at the upper window from which Miss Vane had made her observation. He measured the distance with his eyes. He nodded, very slightly, to himself. "The fog," he said, without turning, "on the evening of the 14th. It was light, yes? Not yet the true London particular." Marsh blinked. "Moderate," they said. "Thickened after midnight." Then Miss Vane could see clearly. At that distance, through glass, with the room fully lit, he turned at last, and his eyes, very green, very still, settled on Marsh with a quality of attention that was not, precisely, comfortable. "She is not a woman who imagines things, I think." "She seemed steady enough," Marsh allowed. "Steady?" Poirot repeated, as though weighing the word. "Yes. Let us go in." He moved through the house with a quality of attention that Marsh found, by turns, impressive and deeply irritating. He did not touch anything. He paused at the threshold of each room as though listening to it. In the hallway, he examined the coat stand. In the dining room, he studied the placing of the chairs around the empty table. On the first-floor landing, he stopped before the drawing-room door and regarded the lock with an expression of mild, concentrated interest. "Cresswell used the spare key," said Marsh. "The door was locked from inside." "From inside?" Poirot murmured. "Yes, that is what everyone has remembered to tell me." The faintest possible emphasis fell on the word "remembered," and Marsh had the distinct, unsettling impression that Poirot found this significant in a way he was not yet prepared to share. Inside the drawing-room, he stood for a long moment before the window. The Persian rug bore still a faint discoloration where the body had lain. He did not look at it. He looked, instead, at the 2 brandy glasses on the side table, one used, one clean, and then at the ledger open on the writing desk. He bent over it, hands clasped behind his back, and read. His expression did not change, but the quality of his stillness altered in some fashion Marsh could not have articulated. Then he straightened, and something in his bearing had shifted. The particular quality of a man who has found, in an apparently empty room, exactly what he came looking for. "Someone arranged this room, mon ami. Not the murderer. No, that would be too simple. Someone else. Someone who came after, and before Cresswell. There is a third presence here, and no one has thought to look for them. H. Poirot, to Inspector Marsh. Marsh stared at him. That's a serious allegation, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot smiled. A small, precise smile entirely without warmth. It is not an allegation, mon ami. It is an observation. The allegations, he said, picking up his hat from the chair where he had set it with geometrical exactness, will come later. First, I think, we must speak to Sir Percival's dinner guests. All 6 of them, and we must watch, very carefully, which of them finds the questions too easy to answer. Poirot conducted his interviews at number 14 itself, a choice that Inspector Marsh considered irregular and Poirot considered essential. A man's rooms, he had observed long ago, speak in the silences between a suspect's sentences. The right setting loosens the tongue. More importantly, it loosens the eyes. He received them in the ground-floor morning room, one by one, with the unhurried courtesy of a physician conducting examinations. He offered each of them tea. He noted, with precision, who accepted it and who held the cup without drinking. Sir Percival Grantham arrived first, punctually, with the composure of a man who has rehearsed composure. He described the dinner in precise, sequential detail, the courses, the seating, the topics of conversation, and Poirot listened with an expression of benign interest that gave nothing away whatsoever. When Poirot asked, quite gently, whether Mr. Ashby had mentioned any anxieties of late, Sir Percival said no, without hesitation, without pause, without the half-second of genuine recollection that an honest answer requires. Poirot noted the absence of that half-second and moved on. He asked about the ledger on Ashby's desk. Sir Percival's left hand, resting on the arm of the chair, tightened by 2 degrees. "I wouldn't know about any ledger," he said pleasantly. Poirot thanked him and poured more tea. Lady Ashworth came next, composed as marble and approximately as yielding. She had, she said, known Ashby socially for some years. They moved in overlapping circles, no more. The careful vagueness of this answer interested Poirot considerably. He asked whether she had observed anything unusual in Ashby's manner at dinner. She said he had seemed, perhaps, a little preoccupied. Poirot asked what he had been preoccupied about. She said she couldn't possibly say. Then, with the smooth efficiency of a woman closing a gate, she added, "Mr. Poirot, I am told you are very clever. I hope you will be clever enough to recognize when a line of inquiry leads nowhere useful." Poirot smiled with great warmth and said he always found that judgment best made at the end rather than the beginning. Miss Vane he treated differently. Less a suspect than a camera, and a camera of exceptional quality. She described what she had seen with the clean, unembellished precision of a woman who knows the difference between observation and interpretation. She had seen the figure collapse. She had not seen anyone else in the room. But then she paused, and the pause had a texture. She said, "There was a light in the room below the drawing room, at ground level. It appeared and went out very quickly. I thought nothing of it at the time." Poirot set down his pen. "At what time precisely, Miss Vane?" She considered. "After the collapse, perhaps 4 minutes after." Poirot thanked her with a sincerity that was, for once, entirely unperformed. Captain Fellows was loud, affable, and, Poirot thought, frightened underneath it, in the way that only men of physical courage can be frightened, with a particular incredulous outrage at their own fear. He confirmed, refilling Ashby's glass, volunteering the information before he was asked, which Poirot found, in itself, revealing. He said they had served together in the Coldstream Guards. He said Ashby was a good man. He said this with the mechanical quality of a declaration prepared in advance, rather than a feeling retrieved from memory. When asked whether he had visited number 14 in the fortnight preceding the dinner, he said no, firmly, immediately. Without the mild, polite bafflement the question warranted if the answer were true. Mrs. Forrest was the most interesting of all, because she was the most transparently attempting not to be. she answered in careful thirds, enough candor to appear open, enough vagueness to conceal, enough composure to suggest she had weighed precisely how much of each to offer. She admitted knowing Ashby better than casually. She did not explain how. She said her husband was in Vienna. She offered this not as fact, but as shield. When Poirot asked, almost as an afterthought, adjusting the angle of his pen, what language she and Ashby had spoken at dinner, she said, "Oh, we exchanged a word in French." He had excellent French, and smiled. And the smile, Poirot noted with quiet satisfaction, arrived 3/4 of a second too late. "Mr. Tench, you are a solicitor. You are accustomed to being told things that are not repeated. Tell me, what was it that Mr. Ashby feared losing?" H. Poirot to Mr. Oliver Tench. Mr. Tench heard this question, set his teacup down with geometric precision, and looked at Poirot for a long moment with the expression of a man recognizing, across a card table, a player of superior quality. Then he said, "Professional privilege, Monsieur Poirot, is not something I surrender to charm." To which Poirot replied, pleasantly, that he quite understood, and that professional privilege, in any case, did not survive the client. Tench went still. Then he said, very quietly, "I shall require guidance from counsel before I say anything further." Poirot thanked him, rose, and held the door open with impeccable courtesy. He had, he reflected, learned everything he needed from the solicitor, not from what Tench had said, but from the precise moment at which he had decided to say nothing at all. It was the ledger that did it. Or rather, it was what the ledger contained. Inspector Marsh's sergeant, a diligent young man called Prewitt, who had spent the better part of 2 days cross-referencing Ashby's cramped entries against the financial records Scotland Yard had quietly requisitioned, delivered his findings on the morning of the 18th with the barely suppressed excitement of a man presenting an examination result he knows to be excellent. The ledger was, in essence, an account book of ruin. Ashby had been a collector, not of art, not of silver, but of secrets. Across 17 pages of meticulous notation, in a cipher that had taken Prewitt's colleague less than an afternoon to decode, were recorded the private catastrophes of a dozen members of respectable London society. Debts concealed from creditors, infidelities concealed from spouses, one commercial fraud of considerable ingenuity, and, on the final page, in fresher ink than the rest, the notation of a sum paid quarterly by a single set of initials, JF £40, quarterly, for 3 years, Captain James Fellows. Marsh said the initials aloud with the satisfaction of a lock turning. Prewitt nodded. It was, they agreed, as clear as these things ever were. Ashby had been bleeding the captain dry. Fellows had endured it for 3 years, had sat at dinner within arm's reach of his tormentor, had refilled the man's glass. And there, Marsh said, was your opportunity, your motive, and your method, all in one neat package. He sent for Fellows that same afternoon. Poirot was present at Marsh's sufferance when Fellows was brought in. The captain had shed his dinner-party affability entirely. He sat across the table from Inspector Marsh with the rigid, forward-facing composure of a man in a court-martial, and he did not deny the payments. He said, with a flatness that struck Poirot as the tone of a man past caring about dignity, "Yes, he knew something about me, about something that happened in the regiment. I paid him to keep quiet about it. I am not proud of it." Marsh pressed him on the brandy glass. Fellows said he had refilled it because he was sitting nearest the decanter. Nothing more. He said it with the convincing simplicity of truth, and then immediately undermined it by adding, "I am not a murderer, Inspector." Which was, as Poirot noted privately, precisely the sort of thing a frightened innocent says, and precisely the sort of thing a clever guilty man knows a frightened innocent would say. Marsh was satisfied. More than satisfied. He was, in the manner of a methodical man who has been handed an untidy case and found it suddenly resolving, almost relieved. He said, afterwards, in the corridor, "Motive, means, opportunity." Refilled the glass himself. 3 years of payments. "It's Fellows, Monsieur Poirot. I'd stake my pension on it." Poirot was quiet for a moment. He adjusted with one precise finger the angle of his hat upon the coat stand. It had been set at a fraction off-center that offended him, and then he said mildly, "Your pension, mon ami, I would not stake. It is too valuable." "You disagree?" Marsh's voice carried the particular weariness of a man who had hoped quite sincerely to be spared this. "I observe only," said Poirot, "that a man who has paid £40 a quarter for 3 years to keep a secret does not then murder in a room with an uncurtained window, in full view of the square, using a poison so refined it required a specialist to detect it. That is not the act of a frightened soldier. That is the act of someone who thinks, someone who plans, someone who knew in advance that a heart attack would be the first conclusion." He paused. "Captain Fellows did not know about the aconitine, Inspector. He does not know now. Watch his face when you mention it to him. The guilty man, he is always relieved to be questioned, because he has prepared his answers. It is the innocent man who is afraid. Fellows, he is terrified. That, to Poirot, is very nearly an alibi in itself." Poirot. Marsh watched Fellows's face when he mentioned the aconitine. The captain's blank, unperforming bewilderment, the specific confusion of a man encountering an entirely unfamiliar word in an entirely familiar nightmare, was not the response of a man who had selected that particular instrument of death with care and foreknowledge. Marsh did not arrest Fellows that afternoon. He released him, instead, with instructions not to leave the city, and he stood in the corridor of number 14 with the expression of a man whose tidy package had come undone at a corner, spilling its contents in directions he had not anticipated. Poirot, beside him, said nothing. He was thinking about a ground-floor light that had appeared and vanished 4 minutes after a man collapsed. He was thinking about a clean brandy glass that had never been used. He was thinking about a solicitor who had gone silent at precisely the wrong moment, and he was thinking, with the focused pleasure of a man whose grey cells are fully engaged, that the truth of this matter was considerably more elegant and considerably more terrible than Captain Fellows's straightforward desperation had ever been. Poirot's method, when he had identified his quarry but not yet assembled the architecture of proof, was not to press harder. It was, rather, to become agreeable, disarmingly, almost insultingly agreeable. The sort of agreeable that makes a guilty person feel, with crawling unease, that they have somehow been forgiven for something they have not yet been accused of. He paid calls. He accepted invitations. He said nothing of consequence, and observed everything. He took tea with Lady Ashworth on the 19th in her drawing-room in Pont Street, and spent 40 minutes discussing, with every appearance of genuine enthusiasm, the relative merits of Limoges versus Sèvres porcelain. Lady Ashworth, who had clearly steeled herself for interrogation, found the experience profoundly disorienting. She relaxed, by imperceptible degrees, into something approaching naturalness. And it was in this unguarded state that she mentioned, with the careful casualness of someone who has decided to mention something rather than have it discovered, that she had once briefly employed Mr. Oliver Tench as her personal solicitor. Before she thought better of it, she added, "We parted on perfectly civil terms." Poirot smiled over his Sèvres cup and said that was very reassuring. He did not ask why she had felt it necessary to characterize the parting at all. He encountered Sir Percival apparently by chance on the steps of his club. Poirot had, with some ingenuity, arranged the chance, and they walked together as far as St. James's Street. Poirot spoke, with meditative sadness, of the difficulties of a man who keeps meticulous records. How burdensome, he mused, such records must be to maintain. How very much more burdensome they must become upon that man's death, when those who feature in the records could never be entirely certain what had been preserved and what destroyed. Sir Percival walked beside him in silence for the length of half a block. Then he said, with studied neutrality, "I imagine Ashby's papers will be gone through thoroughly," Poirot said. "But of course, though I am told the most interesting pages are already with the Yard." This was, in its precise particulars, untrue. Sir Percival's stride shortened by a fraction. They parted at the corner with every expression of mutual goodwill. With Mrs. Forrest, he was gentler and more surgical. He called at her hotel on the 20th, ostensibly to return a glove she had left at number 14 during the police interviews. She received him in the sitting room with the composure of a woman who has spent 2 days rehearsing composure, and it was very good, very nearly perfect. Poirot set the glove on the table between them. Then he said, as though the thought had only just occurred to him, "Madame Forrest, your husband. He is expected back from Vienna soon, I think?" She said yes. The end of the month. Poirot nodded pleasantly and said, "Then it is fortunate, is it not, that Mr. Ashby's ledger contains no entry under the letter F?" He watched her very carefully. The relief that crossed her face lasted perhaps a second before she understood that she had just confirmed, with that single second of relief, that she had known the ledger existed and had known to fear it. "I do not play chess, mon ami. I prefer a simpler game. I make one move, and then I watch. It is not the move that tells me what I need to know. It is the watching." H. Poirot to Inspector Marsh. It was with Mr. Tench, however, that Poirot's psychological economy was most precise. He did not visit the solicitor. He wrote him a letter, 3 sentences on plain notepaper delivered by hand. The letter said only that Poirot had been giving thought to the question of professional privilege, that he had consulted a colleague in the legal profession, and that he looked forward to a further conversation at Mr. Tench's earliest convenience, as certain matters had come to light regarding the disposition of Mr. Ashby's estate, that Mr. Tench would, Poirot felt sure, wish to address before they became a matter of official record. None of this was, in any meaningful sense, true. There was no colleague. There were no matters regarding the estate. It was, in its entirety, a precisely calibrated pressure, applied not to extract a confession, but to watch the shape that a man takes when he feels the walls moving. Tench responded within 2 hours. He requested a meeting. He suggested his office. Poirot suggested pleasantly, somewhere more private, and watched the suggestion land with the weight of an implied threat. They agreed upon the following morning. Poirot replaced the letter in its envelope, aligned it with the edge of his desk, and permitted himself the smallest possible expression of satisfaction. The trap was not yet sprung, but the mechanism, he reflected with quiet pleasure, was wound very nearly to its limit. The morning of the 21st brought frost to Whitmore Square, and, with it, news of a kind that caused Inspector Marsh to sit down heavily in his chair and stare at the middle distance for a full 30 seconds before reaching for the telephone. Miss Dorothea Vane had been found at the foot of the servants' staircase at Lady Ashworth's house in Pont Street at 7:30 that morning, unconscious, with a contusion at the base of her skull consistent. The attending physician was careful with his language. With either a fall or a blow, she was alive. She was not, the physician added, in any immediate danger. She was, however, deeply and stubbornly unconscious, and likely to remain so for some hours, perhaps longer. The servants' staircase at Pont Street was narrow, uncarpeted, and poorly lit. A fall was entirely plausible. It was also, as Poirot observed when Marsh relayed this information by telephone, entirely convenient. "She is the only witness," Marsh said, with the tone of a man stating something he finds personally offensive. "The only person who can place the collapse at a precise time. The only person who saw, or claims to have seen, the ground floor light." "Claims," Poirot repeated gently. "You used that word, mon ami. You did not use it before." A pause. "Coincidences happen." "They do," Poirot agreed. "But this particular coincidence has happened the morning after I sent Mr. Oliver Tench a letter suggesting certain matters had come to light. That is a very specific coincidence. That is almost, how shall one say, a reply." He went to Pont Street at once. Lady Ashworth received him in a state that was, for her, the closest approximation to agitation her formidable composure permitted, which is to say, she was entirely composed, but her hands, folded in her lap, were folded with a degree of deliberateness that suggested they would otherwise not be still. She said that Dorothea had risen early, as was her habit, that she had heard nothing unusual, that she could not imagine how it had happened. Poirot listened to all of this with perfect courtesy. Then he asked, as though it were a matter of only minor administrative interest, whether Lady Ashworth had received any visitors or communications the previous evening. She said no. Then she said, and this addition, Poirot noted, had not been planned, that she had, in fact, had a brief telephone call from a friend on an unrelated matter. She did not specify the friend. She did not specify the matter. She met Poirot's gaze with the steadiness of a woman who has told so many partial truths in her life that she has long since ceased to feel their texture. Poirot examined the staircase. It was, as the physician had suggested, narrow and poorly lit. The third step, from the top, bore a faint, dark smear along its edge. Not blood, but something waxy, applied rather than deposited. A candle stub, perhaps, or something of similar composition. He did not point this out to the constable standing behind him. He filed it, instead, in the precise and capacious library of his grey cells, under a heading he had opened the moment he first stood before Ashby's window and found the room, against all reason, perfectly orderly. The attack on Miss Vane tells me two things. First, that she saw more than she knew she saw. And second, far more importantly, that someone in this affair has begun to be afraid of Poirot. That, mon ami, is when the case becomes truly interesting. H. Poirot to Inspector Marsh. It was Tench who provided the pivot. He arrived for their meeting that morning, white about the mouth and preternaturally still, the stillness of a man who has made, in the small hours, some internal decision of great consequence and is now committed to it past the point of retreat. He sat across from Poirot in the private dining room of the club Poirot had nominated, ordered nothing, and said, after a silence of some 30 seconds, "I should like to speak to you about the terms of Roland Ashby's will." Poirot said nothing. He had learned, long ago, that silence applied at the right moment was the most productive conversational instrument available to him. "Ashby," said Tench, with the exhausted precision of a man dismantling something he has spent years constructing, "left the entirety of his estate, including the contents of the ledger and the rights to all documentation therein, to a single beneficiary." He paused. Not a person, an institution, a private archive, operated by a solicitor's firm, with instructions that the contents be sealed for 20 years, then released. Poirot was very still. And the solicitor's firm," he said softly, "is yours." Tench looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Which means that whoever killed Roland Ashby did not destroy the ledger. They could not, and they know they could not. And the one person who might have confirmed precisely when they entered that house, precisely when that ground-floor light appeared, is lying unconscious in a house in Pont Street." He straightened his cuffs with mechanical exactness. "I think, Monsieur Poirot, that I am in a very great deal of danger." Poirot regarded him with an expression that was not precisely sympathy, but was not entirely without it. "Then it is fortunate," he said quietly, "that you have chosen to speak now rather than later. Sit down, Monsieur Tench. Tell me everything, leave out nothing, and begin, if you please, with the name of the second beneficiary, the one Ashby changed his will to exclude 8 months ago." Tench sat, and at last he began to talk. He did not sleep that night. This was not unusual. There were cases, not many, but some, in which the grey cells, once properly engaged, declined the indignity of rest and continued their quiet, relentless labor through the small hours, assembling and discarding, arranging and rearranging, until the picture they were constructing achieved the only quality Poirot demanded of it. Not probability, not plausibility, but the clean, absolute click of a thing that could not be otherwise. He sat in the armchair of his Whitehaven Mansions flat, with a glass of sirop de cassis untouched on the table beside him, and he thought about a clean brandy glass. It was the clean glass that had troubled him from the beginning, nagging at the periphery of his attention like a picture hung fractionally crooked. 2 glasses on the side table. One used, One clean, the used glass had contained brandy laced with aconitine. The toxicologist was certain of this, but why set out a second glass at all? A man drinking alone sets out one glass. A man expecting company sets out two. Ashby had expected someone. Someone had come. And that someone, this was the precise, sharp point upon which everything else turned, had not drunk. They had refused the brandy, or had not been offered it, or had known, with the particular foreknowledge of the person who had prepared it, that the brandy was not to be consumed. Tench's revelation assembled itself around this central fact with the satisfying inevitability of pieces cast from a single mold. The excluded beneficiary, the name Tench had finally surrendered across the private dining table with the grey, defeated look of a man handing over the last of his ammunition, was Lady Eveline Ashworth. She had been, for 11 years, the primary beneficiary of Roland Ashby's considerable estate. 8 months ago, without explanation offered to Tench and without any known alteration in their social relations, Ashby had rewritten his will entirely, substituting the sealed archive arrangement in her place. 8 months ago. Poirot turned this over with great care. 8 months ago, something had changed between Ashby and Lady Ashworth, not visibly. They had continued to move in the same circles, to appear at the same dinner tables, to exchange the same pleasantries. But underneath, in the private accounting of their arrangement, something had shifted with sufficient force to cause Ashby to disinherit a woman he had evidently, at some point, trusted with the disposition of his entire worldly estate. He thought about the telephone call Lady Ashworth had received the evening before Miss Vane's fall, the unspecified friend, the unrelated matter. He thought about the way she had described her parting from Tench as perfectly civil, volunteering a reassurance no innocent person would have thought to offer. He thought about her hands, folded with such deliberate stillness in her lap. He thought about the ground floor light. This was the clue that had waited, patient and unexamined, at the edge of the picture. 4 minutes after Ashby collapsed, Miss Vane had seen a light appear briefly in the ground floor room of number 14 and vanish. The ground floor room was the study, separated from the drawing room above by an entire story, accessible from the street by the servants' entrance on the side passage, which Cresswell had confirmed was left unlatched until he retired at midnight. Someone had entered through the servants' entrance, someone who knew the house, someone who had been inside number 14 before, recently enough to know which entrance to use, which room contained what they needed, and how long they had before Cresswell's routine brought him past the study door. The window was latched from the inside, yes, but a window latched from the inside proves only that no one left through it. It proves nothing whatsoever about how they arrived. Everyone looked at the window. No one looked at the servants' door. Poirot. The wax on the staircase at Pont Street, that faint, deliberate smear on the 3rd step from the top, was the final piece, not a candle stub, as he had first considered. Poirot had submitted a small sample to a chemist acquaintance that afternoon and received his answer by 8 o'clock, beeswax polish, of the specific composition used on wooden floors. The study floor at number 14 was polished oak. Someone had carried it on the sole of their shoe from Ashby's study to the servants' staircase of a house in Pont Street and had used it, whether by accident or design, to send Miss Vane to the bottom of the stairs. The same shoes, the same person, 2 crimes, 1 pair of feet, and 1 grey-haired widow who had sat across from Poirot drinking tea from Sèvres porcelain and spoken of Limoges with the serene composure of someone who had, she believed, arranged matters beyond the reach of correction. Poirot rose from his armchair at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning, aligned the untouched sirop de cassis precisely with the edge of the table, and permitted himself, in the privacy of his own flat, a small, complete smile. He knew. He had known, if he were honest, since the moment he saw the clean brandy glass, known it as a shape without yet a name, a certainty awaiting its architecture. Now the architecture was complete, down to the last cornice. He would need, he reflected, one further thing, not evidence. He had evidence enough to satisfy even Inspector Marsh's considerable appetite for the tangible. What he needed was a confession, not for the court, for himself, for the precise, unambiguous satisfaction of hearing the truth stated aloud by the person who had lived inside it. He would arrange, he decided, a gathering, tomorrow evening, all 6 of them, in the drawing room of number 14. The room with the uncurtained window and the Persian rug and the side table bearing still in his mind's eye, one used glass and one clean one. He went to bed. He slept, this time, immediately and completely, in the manner of a man whose grey cells have earned their rest.